It really is a different world. We've seen a huge erosion at the lower income levels. People who think they're getting ahead, they're actually losing ground too. The central banks have created this financialization as the foundation of wealth now. They're definitely a cartel.
Please join us for our next live stream on August 4th at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we will go over current events, past guests, and of course, gold and silver news. Once again, our next live stream will be on August 4th, 9 p.m. Eastern. Hope to see you there. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Once again, if you are new to our channel or have not already done so, please do subscribe. Click on the bell to be notified on new updates, and do give us a thumbs up if you like what we do. Our guest today, Charles Hugh Smith, a prolific author and editor of the Of Two Minds blog. Charles' writings have been republished on prominent websites such as Zero Hedge, Financial Sense, and David Stockman's Contra Corner. And we are delighted to have him here today as our guest. Good day, Charles, and welcome to SBTV. How are you doing?
Great. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Patrick.
Yeah, we're glad we could have you on. So I got to start by asking, how is Hawaii?
Well, Hawaii is doing pretty well. Dependent on tourism still, which means we're still dependent on cheap jet fuel. So I don't know how long that kind of economic boom can last. But as you know well, it's lasted for 50 years so far.
Yeah, tourism is still the heartbeat of the economy, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, Charles, let's start with one of your latest writings on your blog titled America's Concealed Crisis, 50 Years of Economic Decline, 1969 to 2019. In this article, you highlighted the staggering loss of purchasing power of the current generation compared to the generation 50 years ago. And a recurring issue that you highlight is that the incomes are not growing as fast as the cost of living and accumulated debt. Can you share with us the gulf of differences in the standards of living between the generation of today and the generation of 1969?
Right. Well, it's a great question, Patrick. And of course, we can talk about generations in general, like the boomers, like myself in their 50s and 60s, and Gen X in their 40s, and the millennials in 20s and early 30s. And it's, as you and I were speaking about before we started recording, it really is a different world. Back in the late 60s and even early 70s, you could get by on a minimum wage job or just a few cents more than that, because apartments were really cheap, food was cheap, gasoline was cheap. And that is no longer possible. Just as one factoid to explain that, one of my friends just told me he came across a statistic, and he said, how many counties in the United States, and there's several thousand counties, how many counties are there that two people can have minimum wage jobs, and they can rent a 2-bedroom apartment? In other words, in a 2-bedroom apartment, like if you had a child or two, you could get by, in a 2-bedroom apartment. How many counties is that affordable for two people working full-time minimum wage jobs? The answer is 0. Not even low-cost states like Mississippi or Arkansas can two people make a minimum wage and have any kind of decent life. And that was not the case. So we've seen a huge erosion at the lower income levels. In other words, if you were in the top 5% 2 generations ago, you were doing well. And if you're in the top 5% now, you're still doing well. But if you're in the bottom 80%, you've lost ground, huge ground.
Why do you say that the middle class is actually the working class today?
Okay, yeah, that's, I'm not trying to be controversial, and I consider myself a working class person in the sense that I've had to work my whole life. It wasn't like I got inherited a silver spoon or anything. And so what's the difference between a working class and a middle class? Well, again, if we go back a couple generations, the middle class had financial security in ways that we have lost in the present. And by that, I mean, when you bought a house in the 60s or early 70s, you could count on a little bit of appreciation every year, something slow and steady. It wasn't a boom or bust kind of investment. And the same thing could be said for your savings accounts. You know, it was required by law that you'd get 5.25% on your savings, and it was so you could build up equity without risk. And now everything is a boom or bust cycle. If you buy a house, you might, if you caught the cycle wrong, you might end up losing all of your down payment, right? Or it may never recover. It's like you're gambling when you buy a house. And the same thing is true of jobs. You know, there's lots of stories that you can find on the internet where people started to work for IBM, or they started to work for Kodak, or they were a school teacher and they built up equity and they had security. And now, unless you work for the government, it's very difficult to find that kind of financial security in the private sector, right? You have to keep moving around and to advance your career, and you're basically managing an enterprise. Your career is an enterprise, and it's full of risk. And the other thing that's different, I think, is kind of traditionally when we talk about the middle class, we talk about the class of people who had precarious financial situation. In other words, they didn't make enough money to build up capital, and their position was often precarious. Like they worked at the factory, and then when the factory had downtime, they lost a couple months' wages, or they were in construction and there were layoffs. And so that precariousness is what now seems to define virtually all workers, you know, except for the 20% that work for the government. And so that precariousness is what I think makes all of us working class now. Very few people have a security that's not really at risk. Like you can have a couple $100,000 in your 401k. And if there's a huge stock market crash, you're going to lose 40, 50, 60% of that. And so that's not security in the way that we experienced security before.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. You just don't see that 25-year career company man anymore unless they work for the government, fireman, policeman, military, one of those things. But getting back to the housing market, 71, our house in Hawaii, it was $17,000. It was about little under 6,000 square foot lot, about 1,100 square foot home, and it was only $17,000 back then. Can you give us an idea of what the housing market is now?
I would say that your family house is probably worth over $750,000, somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million. And so how can a young couple starting out afford a house that's well over 500,000? It's impossible. And we know that, like say in the hot job markets, like San Francisco Bay Area, where I spend some of my time, it's something like 4 or 5% of the population can afford a house. Well, obviously that's not security. No. And we ask, well, why? What happened? And of course, as you've discussed with many other guests in the past, the U.S. and in fact the world went off the gold standard and went totally to a fiat currency system. But more recently, like why was what's happened in the last 20 to 25 years is the central banks have created this financialization as the foundation of wealth now. In other words, your access to cheap capital, like credit, and your access to leverage. And this is how wealth is accumulated, not from working. And I have a chart that's on my site of twominds.com. It's up actually today, showing that the labor's percentage of the economy has been in decline for the last several decades. And in fact, it can be stretched back all the way to 1969, that the median wage adjusted for real world inflation has gone nowhere for 50 years. And even people who think they're getting ahead in the last 20 years, they're actually losing ground too. If we look at, unless you happen to own the assets which have been pushed higher in these financial bubbles, But the problem with that kind of dynamic where central banks pump up assets and create bubbles is bubbles burst, right?
Yeah.
Extremes cannot continue being more extreme. And so then the average person is basically, in my view, is being given the choice. You have to be a fund manager. You have to be a financial expert to play this game now. If otherwise, you might jump in and you're at the top, and you have to sell at the bottom, and your family wealth's been crippled or destroyed.
Yeah, Charles, we'll get into to all of those things shortly. But in a few prior articles, you also compare the decline of the Roman Empire with the decline of America. Do you think there are eerie similarities between the decline of Rome and the current decline of America?
Yeah, I think I do, and a lot of other people see parallels too. And I want to mention that there's been a lot of empires around the world. I mean, the Chinese dynasties going back several thousand years. We have the Incas and Mayans in the Americas. The reason why so many of us focus on Rome is we have a lot more records. You know, we have a huge amount of records still left from that very distant age. And so we know quite a bit about what people were saying in real time at that as Rome declined. And we have quite a few records about some of the dynasties in China. But so that's why we refer to it's not that that what I found is you could make the same arguments about the Mayans and the Incas in terms of the structure of their economy becoming more fragile and brittle, and there's things like that we could find in other empires, because all empires are based on human nature, right? We're still the same. We still have the same wetware that we had, 5,000 years ago, but we use Rome because we have a lot of documentation. So yeah, there's a lot of people comment on various aspects of the Roman decline. One is the moral decline, and basically it was something where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and political power became concentrated, in the upper class elites, right? And that's of course what we see now in America. Even worse, the elites who gathered all the wealth and the political power used that power in self-serving ways. In other words, in the original Roman Republic, then you achieve social status in the elite by leading troops in the army and serving the nation, or Rome, and you were expected to donate huge sums of money to build public buildings or temples or fund festivals. You were supposed to spend your wealth, and this is how you gained status, right? And if you study anthropology, this is a standard thing in many cultures around the world, that status is earned by leadership and selfless sacrifice on behalf of the common good. Well, all that's lost in Rome, right? Yeah. And so then you have all these, in the last, hundreds plus years of the Western Roman Empire, you have this ceaseless churn of really poor leadership and that's doing basically doing self-serving things and not really focusing on what can I do for the common good. So we see that in America. And then we see that financially, they start spending more than they really have. In other words, their tax base was huge, but they had a huge expense in terms of the military, that they needed to defend borders. And without going into too much detail, there was we hear about the barbarians and so on. It was just other people that were not yet part of the Roman Empire were pushing into Roman territory because they were getting pushed by Mongols and other tribes coming out of Eurasia. So there were these huge demographic changes that was pressuring Rome. And that's similar, I think, to the world we have now, where there's just, a lot of people and there's more expenses, right? I mean, the government is having huge expenses. And in Rome, where they called it bread and circuses, right? Toward the end, the government was funding free bread for any citizen in Rome. And also throwing these huge, elaborate displays of games and basically battles, in the Colosseum and so on, we're familiar with. So I think those are all parallels. And what happens is when an empire gets under financial stress, it starts diluting its money. You can say it's debauching it or devaluing it, and that's what Rome did. They started shaving the silver off their coins, and then they'd reissue the coinage, but with a lower percentage of silver and gold. And so then they start creating inflation, right? And then they start creating hoarding because, and this is some people focus on, we can tell Rome's decay by the amount of coins that were buried by people. In other words, the hoarding gets more extreme, and people start hoarding more when things start falling apart. And so I think we can discern that kind of movement in not just in America, but in all the leading economies. A decay of their underlying finances. Their tax revenues are not sufficient to cover their expenses, and their expenses are running far faster, increasing faster than their tax revenues.
Okay, so it wasn't just any one particular event that caused the fall of Rome. It was a combination of all of these things happening more or less all together in the same time frame.
That's right. And but I think we can and it's easy to get distracted, but we can compare the Western Roman Empire, the one we're talking about, with the Eastern Roman Empire, which is known as the Byzantine Empire, which was based in Constantinople, now Istanbul. And that empire survived for another 1,000 years. And people have wondered, well, why was that? How did the Eastern Roman Empire survive and the West fell? Well, they had better leadership. Again, we're talking about a leadership that's focused on the common good and not just self-serving. And then they also they had retained social mobility. In other words, that you could be born poor and you could advance up. So there was room for the ambitious. And in the U.S., we're familiar with the Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and the sort of tech world where people without a lot of prestige or wealth can rise up and become billionaires. And these are the heartwarming stories that power American capitalism and so on. But setting aside those those handful of people that are enormously successful, the Larry Ellisons and so on, who came from poverty. What about the average person? What are our chances to get ahead? And I feel that there's a degradation there. It's getting harder and harder to get ahead. And that undermines your social contract. And I think that's one reason why the East survived and the West imploded in Rome.
Okay, yeah, I can't help but feeling like history is repeating itself. The founding generation being united to build a country, but with growing affluence, and the latter generation forgets the hard work of past generations. They feel more entitled, they take on more risk, take on more debt. But would you attribute this somewhat repeating of history simply to basic human behavior?
Absolutely. Excellent point, Patrick. And that, we all habituate is the term we use to what we know. And so, of course, if we didn't live it, then we don't think of it. We only think about what we've lived. And so this sense of entitlement that you describe is just natural. And so I think we can kind of trace a lack of a decline in the willingness to sacrifice for the common good. Now, people are still working very hard and sacrificing for their careers and for their families, right? If anything, people are working harder and longer now than they were 20 years ago. And I think I see this, that the demands of their jobs is rising as their incomes stagnate. So then people feel like they're in a vice, right? They're burning out from like these long commutes and really heavy pressure in their workload, and then they're trying to raise their kids in a very troubled society, and then their income is really stagnant unless they happen to hit the jackpot, in an IPO, or they happen to buy a house in a really hot market that's doubled or tripled. And so that's to be fair to the people now. I think they've also lost sight, or they didn't have an experience of an easier an easier financial time, which is what we're talking about. And the French call it the Trente Glorieuses, like the glorious 30 years between 1945 and the end of World War II and 1975, right? There was like this huge period of growth throughout really the whole world, other than China, because China, blocked itself off in the Cultural Revolution. China basically kicked that forward a few years, and their glorious 30 years started in the late 80s, right? So, so what happens after your glorious that spurt when energy's cheap and assets are cheap and there's a sense of rising, the tide is lifting all boats. What happens when that ends? And I think we can tell the general story, and it goes back to the imperial days, is then the leadership tries to finesse everything and make it look like the prosperity is still rising. And I think that's where we are today.
I found it very interesting that you highlighted that the aristocracy of the early Roman Republic lost almost a third of its membership in wars. They were heavily invested in the common interest of the Republic to the point of participating in battles. Compared to today, only one presidential candidate had boots on the ground in combat theaters. I'm curious of who that person was and what did this difference mean to you personally?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Patrick. And to the best of my knowledge, I can't say for a fact because I haven't looked at all 23 Democratic candidates in detail. But to my knowledge, Tulsi Gabbard, the politician from the state of Hawaii who's running for the U.S. president in the Democratic field, she served in the U.S. military, in the Army, in combat zones in Iraq. And so I think she's the only candidate that served in the military and certainly served in a combat zone. And so this is a huge difference. And I think I've seen statistics. You ask about what I think about it. And I think statistically, the number of people in the U.S. Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, who have served in the military has declined precipitously. I think it used to be on the order of 60% or 50%, and now it's like 20% or less. And as we know, there's a big difference between getting a gilded position, like a lot of politically powerful families. One of the sons or daughters might join the military, and then they get a plum position. They're a journalist or something like that. I'm thinking of the Gore family, and so they're not really experiencing combat, and they're not really having to put their actual lives at risk. And so I think if you looked at the number of elite leaders in the U.S. who actually served in combat, then the number drops to near zero. And so how can you lead your empire if you yourself are protected from risk? And I think that we're talking about physical risk in combat, but we're also talking about financial risk. And of course, that's the other thing that happens as empires decline is the wealthy are protected from losses from their own actions. And so we get the big, too big to fail bank bailouts and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I can't, when we're starting to touch a little bit on financial, and I can't help but to notice that 1969 was just 2 years away from 71, where President Nixon had closed the gold window temporarily, and the U.S. dollar became delinked from gold. Do you think there's a connection between America's economic decline and the fact that the money people use every day became unbacked, unsound, and prone to inflation?
Yes, absolutely. And, Patrick, I know you've discussed this topic with many other people, and it's considered a truism, right? Because it's just so obvious. Like, well, wait a minute, how come these glorious 30 years ended and we've had 30 years of a decline for the bottom 80%? Like, well, why? And of course, I would like to link that financial move to fiat unbacked currencies to another issue, which is energy. Now, energy used to be really cheap in the 60s, right? And so the other thing that happened, as we know, in early 70s was the price of oil basically quadrupled.
Yeah.
And it's gone up and down since then, but it's certainly moved higher. And the U.S. Production of energy peaked right around that same time, 70, 71. And now we're reaching back up to those totals. But of course, our population's gone up by 100 million people too. So, it's like the low cost, abundant energy peaked right around that same time. The third thing I'd mention that happened when Nixon, and I don't want to say that it was his fault, because any president would have been forced to do the same thing for a reason I'm going to explain right now. The other impact was it changed the way that the global economy works, because part of when you go to a fiat currency, to keep everything stable, then you also have to kind of rig all those currencies, and that's called the Bretton Woods system, and that came in around the same time and was adjusted when the Japanese yen became dominant in the 80s. And so you start rigging the system to keep it from falling apart, and then you lose your resiliency because you basically said there's no market here. We're going to rig the market, kind of like the way the Chinese yuan is pegged to the dollar. Well, you're basically rigging the system,
Yeah.
and you're rigging it for a reason, but you're taking away the resilience that comes from having a free market. So that was part of what happened was all the currencies got rigged. And so if the pegs are broken, then you see these huge destabilizations, right? And so when you look at currencies like in South America or Africa, that they try to peg their currency, and then the peg breaks, or Thailand in 1997, then the whole system falls apart because it's not really a market, right? So markets being free are have a certain resiliency, right? They fluctuate, but they allow for all informants to be acting on the information that's available. Where if you're trying to maintain a peg, then you get a fragile system. So what happened in 71 was the U.S. was starting to import more goods and services than it was exporting, right? So the net result of that is how do you change that? How do you pay the difference? Well, you pay the difference by sending your gold abroad. And so, because if people demand gold instead of U.S. dollars, which was their right, then you're going to have to send your gold abroad, and eventually you're going to run out of gold. Or you have to change your import and export balance it back to even Steven, or perhaps start running surpluses again. And so it served the U.S. and I know this is a complicated topic, and I might be making a hash of it, but it served the U.S. interest at that time to be an importer, because we were serving our allies like like Japan and South Korea and Europe by being their market. In other words, they could sell all their stuff to the U.S. and we would absorb all those imports, but we couldn't do it and stay on the gold standard. And so there was a huge trade-off made that we're still trying to understand, I think, And as you say, the net impact for the bottom 80% of American households is that was a catastrophic loss of sound money, and that the globalization that was supposed to be the benefit of getting off the gold standard, that ended up being a negative too, because all we've done is corporations have offshored jobs in order to maximize their profits. And so it's like kind of a double whammy against the bottom 80%.
Charles, why do you call higher education and healthcare in the U.S. cartels?
Great question, Patrick, and cut me off if I start going on too long. A cartel is where there's a group of entities or organizations that fix the price. And we're familiar with cartels, like tobacco was a cartel, right? A few huge tobacco companies basically set the price of cigarettes and so on. And oil was a cartel in the early 20th century, right, with Rockefeller Standard Oil. And big pharmaceutical companies are basically cartels, right? They tend to set their prices high, and they work together, lobbying the government to keep prices high. So this is a cartel structure. And it's why do companies conspire in cartels? Well, because that's how they guarantee high profits. Healthcare is, as we know, it used to be a very dynamic and broad-based industry, but it's been consolidated. Now there's a handful of insurers, there's a handful of huge hospital chains, and so they act as cartels to keep pricing either obscure, like you don't really know the price of the operation you're going to have at the hospital because they're adjusting it constantly and keeping it hidden so that they can manipulate it to get the maximum out of the insurer or the government or whomever. And so they're definitely a cartel, and that's a big reason why healthcare is so costly in the U.S. And we have to remember, we spend in the U.S. about double or even triple what other developed countries like Japan and France spend per person. We're not talking about the population as a whole. We're just saying we spend double per person. And the outcomes, sometimes fantastic, sometimes not so great. So then higher education is the same thing, that the university system has a lock on the credential, the issuing of the credential. And if you want a diploma, you've got to go to an accredited college. And of course, then they act as a cartel, keeping prices high. We don't really see any real competition. We're starting to see some now where if you're going to get a digital, like an online classes only diploma, then the price drops from $20,000 a year to $6,000. But in my view, if we accredited the student and not the institution, then the institution would have they would lose control of that credential, and they couldn't act as a cartel to keep prices high. They'd have to really start competing by providing a better education for a lower cost. So that's why those two industries are so expensive and so ineffective. That's what you get with a cartel structure.
Yeah, I recall the government, they got into the business of financing student loans, and university degrees just took off like a rocket after that. I guess the universities knew that they were going to get paid from the government, so just go ahead and start raising the prices. And I think that's what we saw, and maybe that is partially why there's so much student debt right now, because the universities did raise their tuitions.
You're right, and it's as soon as you guarantee a payment that is not competitive, then then you've got a cartel structure, and the customer is the one who's going to lose out. And so that's what's happened in higher education and in the hospitals. And so again, it's almost like we've lost touch with reality, that it used to be like you could go to college and your whole 4 years would be like $10,000. And it's like now it's tenfolds to 100,000, not even counting your living expenses and the operations that, procedures in a hospital. If it was several $1,000s, that was considered a lot of money. Now you go in for almost anything and it's $100,000. I mean, it's crazy. And yet I'll make a very quick point here. What's astonishing to me that goes back to the Roman Empire is a lot of the candidates for presidency are talking about, well, we need to get rid of student loans. We need to make college free. We need to make healthcare free. Not a single candidate is asking, why did the cost go up tenfold in the last 30 years? No one's looking at the price structure. They simply want to borrow the money and pay the profiteering, the people who are not providing a good education and not providing affordable health care. They want to reward the people who are basically ripping us off. I don't think that's a solution.
Yeah, I think anytime you get the government involved, private sector, they will tend to inflate prices. And I can even say from a construction standpoint where typically, okay, like a state like Hawaii, it's a Democratic state, and typically the Democrats will try to get the unions to endorse their Democratic candidates. And what happens then is they get in office, and then the state, all of a sudden, they have all of these construction jobs that they give to the union workers, which it was those workers that supported that Democratic candidate. And so we kind of see the cost of construction, we see it increase and inflate quite a bit. And it's because, I feel anyway, because once government gets involved, private sector knows, and the price starts to go up.
Absolutely. And I've seen a chart, I've posted it on the site several times, where if you track in higher education the number of professors who are actually teaching and the number of administrators, you see that the line of the administrators is shot straight up and the number of professors in the classroom is basically level. And the same thing is true of healthcare, that the number of administrators in the whole system, people are basically pushing paper, compliance officers and all this stuff, that's shot up. And the number of doctors actually, practicing, serving patients is like flatlined. And so
Yeah.
this is what happens when the government gets involved, as you say, is they're basically giving the private enterprises that are in cartels free reign to just add a bunch
Yeah.
of very expensive administration, layers of complexity, and yet not put the money in actually serving the public or the customers.
Yeah, because I mean, going back to it, I remember when I got in the electrical apprenticeship program back then, it was like $7 an hour. But every year, every 6 months, you would get like $1 raise, and I was even thinking back then, how are they gonna keep? How are they gonna afford me if my salary keeps going up every? I mean, even back then, the numbers just weren't adding up. But anyway, moving forward. Um, Many measures of debt in the U.S. is up, as we discussed: student loan debt, auto loans, household debt. We're talking trillions of dollars of debt piling up every year, but nothing serious seems to have happened, and people seem to be getting immune to the debt pile. Do you think a reckoning is due for this unprecedented level of debt accumulation, and how do you think it will change America when it happens?
That's a terrific question, Patrick. And I think we could say the same. We can ask the same of Europe and Asia and China. That every economy is playing the same game, which is increasing growth by increasing debt. Right, spending money that you borrowed from the future. And I think like I think one way to understand this is when you have an economy with very little credit, then when you introduce credit and people can borrow money to do something productive, like start businesses, buy tools, increase their productivity, then that's a very positive development. In other words, it feeds on itself. People are borrowing for good reason, and they're investing that money wisely in increasing productivity. And we can see this in fast-growing economies, like say the U.S. in the 1820s or Japan in the 1960s and so on. So, but when you get to the late stage of imperial decline, which is what we're talking about, the money's borrowed and it's just speculated. It's put into housing, which doesn't really create productivity. It's put into student loans that people get credentials that aren't really worth very much. Yeah. And it's put into these assets like stocks and so on that are basically just bubbles. And so that's unproductive use of debt and or just wild spending, right? Like just spending to go out and eat 3 or 4 times a week. So that's the difference. In other words, if you're borrowing money wisely and borrowing the minimum amount you need to increase your own productivity, then you're going to get gains. But if you're just spending the money on financial bubbles and consumerism, then you're creating a debt pile that accrues interest, right? And that's the killer. And so we all know the dynamic in play now is the debt pile is increasing, the cost of servicing that debt goes up. And so the game that central banks have played for the last 20 years is, well, we're going to lower interest rates to zero so you can keep borrowing and it will hardly cost anything, right? So then you get, and we see this in 1% auto loans and so on. Like, you can afford a car. It used to be 7% interest. Well, now it's only 1%. And so, but where does that game go? And so people look at Japan and they go, well, Japan's, got 250% of its GDP in debt, and they're still going fine. They're stagnant, but life's still good. And but Japan's a unique situation, as many of us know from their culture and the fact that they're willing to buy their debt themselves and earn no interest. But in the global economy, it's like, how does it work if bonds, if you're supposed to give people your cash and you're not earning any return? That I don't think that's a sustainable function, because as we know, pension plans and insurance companies and big investors, they need a return. And so if you're going to say, well, you're not going to get any return, or it's actually going to cost you money because the yield is negative, how does the system support itself? And the answer is it really can't. And so there's this sense of fragility here if you're going to rely on debt. And I think a lot of us feel that if we get full-blown socialism or social spending, like we want $1 trillion to get rid of student loan debt and $1 trillion for free Medicare and $1 trillion for universal basic income, all these trillions are going to be borrowed. And at some point, that huge flood of free money is going to create inflation. And so far, for the last 20 years, we've had this game where they understate inflation, so it looks like it's not a problem. But at some point, we're going to get a system break, I think, where inflation is going to start coming up. Interest rates will have to go up, and then the debt will be completely unaffordable. And we keep being reassured by central banks and so on. That's never going to happen. We can just keep borrowing trillions, and interest rates will never go up. But history doesn't say that's likely.
Charles, would you say we're past the point of no return, and that there's no way America can avoid this coming collapse of the everything bubble?
I would say we're definitely past that point where there's only going to be two options. And I'm not alone in this. A lot of people feel the same way. Either there's a deflationary collapse of debt where defaults spread throughout the system, and when a company or an individual defaults, then there's a loss, right? They're not going to pay back the loan they took out. Well, those losses have to be taken by somebody, and so then that will break the system, right? Or they're going to inflate the currency away by just giving everybody trillions of dollars so they can continue to service their debt, right? There's really no other solution available, and either one of those solutions will break the system eventually. They're not really solutions. They're temporary fixes. And so the illusion is, well, we're going to get back to real, organic, secular growth if we can just get over this rough spot. And that's where your question implies there really is no way to get over the rough spot, because we're creating the rough spot. That our solution is, in fact, the problem.
For yourself, Charles, how are you preparing you and your family for this coming fiat event?
Well, that's a very good question, and also one that we all struggle with, because there doesn't seem to be one easy answer. And so clearly diversifying one's ownership of assets is a good start, and diversifying your skill sets so that you can always have a way to earn money, because some skills are going to be in demand, and so you want to broaden your range of skills and experience so that you can always create value in because the economy is always looking for value, right? And value flows to scarcity. So if you have skill sets or a combination of skill sets that are scarce, you can always earn money. So that's going to be a plus. And then in terms of diversifying assets, well, if we look at periods of high inflation, when the currency finally devalues and is reset, or the system breaks down, whatever had value still has value. So in other words, you have a tool, you have shelter, those things are still going to have value. Whether they're worth $1 or $1 million, we don't know, but it'll still have value. It'll still producing value in the economy. So you want to look for assets that are going to still have value no matter what happens to the financial market. And of course, people look at precious metals, and they look at property, because land, if it's productive land, then it's going to have value. And, I think people should look at cryptocurrencies, which is a new technological thing. And so it's going to be hard to know how that's going to play out. There's a lot of risk involved in that sector, but people are interested, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, well, I think you're in a pretty safe part of the world, being that Hawaii still is pretty much isolated just because of its geographical positioning. You got a lot of fish there. I know there's a lot of wild pigs running around the place, and you'll always have food. So I think you'll come out ahead. Always try to put yourself in a place where you have resources that you can use for yourself. Charles, before we wrap up, can you let our listeners know more about your work and the Of Two Minds blog?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. You'll find all my work is free on the blog, all my essays, and I have sample chapters of my 14 books on the economy and society that you can read for free.
Okay. And are you active on Twitter where guys can go ahead and follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, I am, and there's a link to Twitter to my Twitter account on my blog, and that's the quickest way to follow me on Twitter and also to join my Facebook page.
Well, Charles, I do hope we can get you on again. I'm thankful that you're here, and but if we can get you on again next time, I will be wearing my Hawaiian shirt to join you.
Yeah, thank you. That'll be great. And I really enjoyed your the interview, and I think you asked the questions that everybody should be asking if they want to prosper through the coming times. So thank you very much.
That was Charles Hugh Smith, editor of the Of Two Minds blog. For more of his insights on the global economy, please visit www.of2minds.com. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on new content, and do also check out the SBTV podcast on iTunes and Spotify.